My brothers out the houses, businesses, and all the money. I got a patch of useless Texas desert. You know how they say you never forget where you were when your life changed forever? Well, mine changed at a funeral home that smelled like cheap roses and broken dreams. Dad's funeral. The black suit felt like it was strangling me, but not nearly as much as the looks my older brothers kept shooting my way. Jake and Mark. Those two had always been the golden boys of our family. 6'2", broad shoulders, confident smiles that could sell ice to an Eskimo. They wore success like a second skin, while I was more like the receipt you find crumpled up in your pocket 3 months later. The one you forgot you even had. Standing there in that lawyer's office afterward, I watched them divide up Dad's empire like they were carving a Thanksgiving turkey. Real estate in Austin, the construction business, stock portfolios that had more zeros than my bank account had dollars. And me? I got the leftover drumstick nobody wanted. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Poor guy probably went to law school thinking he'd be defending innocent people or writing important contracts. Instead, he was stuck reading wills to dysfunctional families on a Tuesday afternoon. His monotone voice droned on about assets and beneficiaries until he got to my part. 160 acres in West Texas. That's what they left me. Sounded impressive until you realized it was basically a patch of dirt so barren that even the tumbleweeds had packed up and moved to Arizona. This wasn't prime Texas real estate we're talking about here. This was the kind of land that made you wonder if Mother Nature had been having a particularly bad day. Jake, always the practical one, gave me that patronizing pat on the shoulder. You know the one. The kind of pat you give a dog who just brought you a dead squirrel thinking it's a gift. His words still ring in my ears like a broken church bell. He told me I was a family tech guy, so maybe I could fix something out there in the sand. Maybe repair the desert itself. Mark, with that shark smile of his, suggested I dig for a fountain while I was at it. Maybe strike oil. They thought they were being hilarious. I thought they were showing their true colors. The thing about being overlooked is that you start seeing things differently. Like wearing shoes that are too small. It hurts, but you learn to walk in ways nobody else thinks to try. I'd been walking differently my whole life. My hands felt like they weighed 100 pounds each when I signed those papers. My stomach was doing backflips like I'd eaten gas station sushi. To them, that deed was an afterthought. A burial receipt for the brother they'd already written off. See, while they were off becoming successful businessmen, I was the guy who fixed things. Air conditioners that wheezed like old men, truck engines that sounded like dying animals, washing machines that had given up the will to live. I was good at it, don't get me wrong, but there's a difference between being skilled at something and being respected for it. Dad never explained the will before he passed. Maybe he thought I'd understand. Maybe he didn't think I needed words. I remembered him once saying something that seemed random at the time. Troy, you don't plant a flag where others built castles. You build where no one dared to. Back then, I thought he was being poetic. Now, standing with those papers in my hand, maybe he was just leaving me a map. The drive out to see this inheritance of mine took 3 hours through some of the most desolate country you've ever seen. Highway 285 stretches through West Texas like a concrete ribbon connecting nothing to nowhere. Mile after mile of scrub brush, cattle guards, and the occasional oil derrick standing like a steel scarecrow against the endless sky. When I finally found the property, I just sat in my truck for a solid 10 minutes, staring. The realtor had described it as raw land with development potential. What she'd failed to mention was that the only thing developing out there was my growing sense that I'd been royally screwed over. Picture this. 160 acres of what looked like the surface of Mars after a bad divorce. Rocky, sandy, dotted with the occasional mesquite tree that looked like it was questioning every life choice it had ever made. The only signs of civilization were a few rusted fence posts and what might have been a cattle skull bleached white by decades of Texas sun. I got out of the truck and walked around, my boots crunching on ground that sounded like it hadn't seen rain since flip phones were cool. The silence was absolute. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that makes you check if you've gone deaf. Even the wind seemed to take a detour around this place. That's when reality hit me, like a freight train carrying a load of bitter truth. This was it. This was my share of the family fortune. So worthless. Vultures probably used it as a rest stop between actual destinations. They got the profitable businesses, the investment properties, the assets that would set them up for life. I got God's forgotten parking lot. But you know what they say about hitting rock bottom? At least you know which direction is up. Standing there in that wasteland, something strange happened. Instead of feeling sorry for myself, I started feeling angry. Not bitter angry, but the kind of clean, focused anger that burns away everything except determination. The kind that makes you realize you've been playing defense your whole life, when you should have been on offense. My dad used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he's given, but by what he does with what he's got. Easy words when you're sitting on a pile of money and successful businesses. Harder words when you're standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing but dirt and dreams. I thought about all those years of being the family afterthought. All those holiday dinners where Jake and Mark would talk about their latest deals while I sat there like a potted plant. All those times they'd introduce me as their little brother who fixes things, with that tone that suggested fixing things was slightly less respectable than being a professional disappointment. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if I'd been in the mood to appreciate beauty. Instead, I was calculating. This land might look like God's forgotten corner, but it was mine, free and clear. No mortgage, no business partners, no older brothers looking over my shoulder telling me what I was doing wrong. I walked to the highest point on the property, which wasn't saying much since the whole place was flatter than a pancake, and surveyed my kingdom, my pathetic, sun-baked, middle-of-nowhere kingdom. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I'd never felt before, complete ownership of my own destiny. The drive back to town gave me time to think, really think, about all the ways my brothers had underestimated me over the years, about all the times they dismissed my opinions, my ideas, my potential. To them, I was a guy who fixed their AIC. To me, I was finally becoming something else. See, there's something about being written off that either destroys you or sets you free. It took me 34 years to figure out which one it was going to be for me. Standing on that forgotten patch of Texas dirt, I finally knew. That night, I sat in my apartment, a one-bedroom place that had seen better decades, and really looked at the deed to my land. The legal description was a bunch of numbers and coordinates that meant nothing to most people. But to me, it represented possibility. Not the kind of possibility my brothers would recognize, but the kind that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. I thought about garage inventors and napkin entrepreneurs, people who turned disasters into empires with nothing but stubbornness and vision. I pulled out my laptop and started researching West Texas geology, mineral rights, land use regulations. I read until my eyes burned and my coffee went cold. Not because I had any particular plan, but because I had something I'd never had before, time and space to think without anyone telling me what I should be thinking about. The more I read, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the land I'd inherited. Sure, it looked like a wasteland, but Texas is full of surprises. Oil discoveries that made millionaires out of ranchers. Natural gas finds that transformed entire communities. Rare minerals that nobody knew existed until somebody with the right equipment went looking. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I was going to move out to that land. Not permanently. I wasn't that crazy, but I was going to put a trailer out there and spend some real time getting to know what I'd inherited. If it really was as empty as it looked, at least I'd know for sure. And if it wasn't, well, that would be interesting. The decision felt like jumping off a cliff without checking to see if there was water below. But I'd been playing it safe my whole life. And where had that gotten me? Standing in the shadow of two brothers who treated me like a repair manual. They only opened when something was broken. I called my boss at the repair shop and told him I was taking some time off. Indefinite time off. He wasn't happy, but he understood. Small-town Texas is full of people who've had to reinvent themselves when life handed them a raw deal. He wished me luck and told me my job would be there if I needed it. Then I started making arrangements. A used trailer I could haul out to the property, a generator for power, a water tank, the basics of civilization in a place that had apparently been forgotten by it. My brothers would have hired consultants and drawn up business plans. I was going to do it with my own two hands and whatever common sense I'd accumulated. The last thing I did before leaving town was drive by the cemetery where Dad was buried. His headstone was simple, just his name and dates. No fancy quotes or religious verses, just the facts of his existence carved into granite. I stood there for a while, not really talking to him, but not exactly staying quiet either. I half expected Dad Stone to chuckle. The man never said much, but his silences had meanings. Maybe this land was his last long silence, waiting for me to listen. I told him about the land, about my brothers, about the decision I'd made. I told him I was going to find out what that patch of desert was really worth, and that maybe, just maybe, he'd raise one son who could surprise everyone. As I drove away from his grave, I thought about those words he'd said years ago about building where no one dared to. At the time, I thought he was just trying to make me feel better about always getting the short end of the stick. Now I wondered if he'd been preparing me for this moment all along. The desert was waiting, empty, silent, and full of possibilities I couldn't even imagine yet. What looked like nothing to everyone else was starting to look like everything to me. Because sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit isn't money or property or successful business. Sometimes it's the freedom to fail spectacularly or succeed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And nobody, not even your own family, can take that away from you. The wasteland was calling my name. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to answer. The wasteland was calling my name, and I answered with a beat-up single-wide trailer and enough determination to power a small town. Moving out to that godforsaken piece of Texas wasn't exactly what you'd call a smart business decision. More like the kind of move that makes your family start whispering about intervention and therapy. But there I was, parking my entire life in the middle of nowhere. The trailer became everything. My home, my office, my fortress against the world that had written me off as Jake and Mark's disappointing little brother. Some people have corner offices with views of the city skyline. I had a view of endless scrub brush and the occasional roadrunner who seemed just as confused about what he was doing there as I was. The silence out there was something else entirely. Not the comfortable quiet you get in a library or a church, but the kind of silence that makes you wonder if the rest of the world just packed up and moved to Mars without telling you. During the day, I drive 40 minutes to the repair shop in town, fixing everything from ancient John Deere tractors that wheeze like emphysema patients to kids' remote control cars that had given up the will to live. It was honest work, but my soul was starving for something more. Something that would answer the question that kept bouncing around my head like a ping-pong ball in a clothes dryer. What am I really doing here? The evenings were when things got interesting. When the sun disappeared behind the horizon and painted the sky in colors that would make a Hollywood sunset look like amateur hour, that's when the desert showed its true personality. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of cricket symphonies and the occasional coyote howl that sounded like loneliness given a voice. I'd sit outside my trailer with a cold beer and just listen, really listen, to the wind through the mesquite trees, to the settling sound of the land that had been doing its thing long before humans showed up with their grand plans and bigger egos. 3 weeks into my desert adventure, something happened that changed everything. It was one of those nights when the moon hung over the desert like a giant pearl somebody had dropped from heaven. I was walking around my property, because that's what you do when you own 160 acres of nothing, when something caught my eye. A rock. Not just any rock. Mind you, this was maybe the size of a baseball. Sitting there among thousands of other rocks, like it was waiting for somebody to notice it. What made it special wasn't how it looked in daylight. What made it special was what happened when the moonlight hit it just right. It glowed, not like some cheesy glow-in-the-dark toy from a cereal box, but with this soft blue-purple light that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the stone itself, like it had swallowed a piece of the aurora borealis and was slowly digesting it. I stood there staring at this thing for a solid 5 minutes, wondering if the isolation was finally getting to me, Was I having some kind of desert-induced hallucination? Had I been eating too much gas station jerky? But no matter how many times I blinked or rubbed my eyes, that rock kept glowing like a tiny alien beacon. Now, I'm a practical guy. When something doesn't make sense, I try to figure out why. When a machine makes a weird noise, I listen until I understand what it's telling me. When a rock starts glowing in the middle of nowhere, I get curious instead of scared. I'd always been drawn to how things work, the logic of gears and circuits, the predictable behavior of electricity and combustion. But this was something else entirely. This was like finding magic in a world that had convinced me magic didn't exist. My hands were shaking when I pulled out my phone. The camera on that old thing wasn't exactly National Geographic quality, but it caught enough to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The blue-purple glow showed up clear as day in the photos, like the rock was posing for its close-up. I took maybe a dozen pictures from different angles, trying to capture what my eyes were seeing. Each photo showed the same impossible thing, an ordinary-looking rock that glowed like it had its own internal power source, like someone had wired it up to a battery made of starlight. Here's where most people would probably call their friends or post on social media with a bunch of fire emojis, and OMG, you guys. But I didn't have many friends, and the idea of my brother seeing this and finding some way to make fun of it made my stomach turn. Instead, I did what any lonely guy with mystery rock would do. I went online, specifically to a geology forum where people with way too much time on their hands argued about whether sedimentary rocks were better than igneous ones. These were the kind of folks who got genuinely excited about mineral formations and could tell you the difference between feldspar and quartz just by licking it. The forum was called Rockhounds Anonymous, which should tell you everything you need to know about the level of social awkwardness you could expect to find there. But these people knew their stuff. They were the kind of experts who could identify a rock sample from a blurry photo taken in poor lighting by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. I created an account with the username DesertDweller85 and posted my photos with a title that probably made me sound like a complete amateur. Found this glowing rock in West Texas. What is it? 3 question marks, because apparently I wanted to make sure everyone knew how confused I was. Then I waited and waited, posted at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, figuring maybe the international rock nerds would be online while America slept. I made myself a sandwich, watched part of an old Western on TV, and tried not to check the forum every 30 seconds like some kind of desperate teenager waiting for a text back. The response came at 3:17 a.m., just as I was drifting off to sleep with dreams of glowing rocks dancing in my head. My phone buzzed with notification that made my heart skip like a scratch CD. The reply was from someone with the username StonyJohnny47, which was either the most clever geology pun ever or the most unfortunate coincidence in internet history. His message was short but packed with more excitement than a geology forum probably sees in a typical month. Holy cow, is that fluorescent quartz? Where exactly did you find this? That blue-purple glow is classic fluorite coloration, but the crystal structure looks like quartz. This could be really rare stuff. Fluorescent quartz. The words hit me like a lightning bolt made of pure possibility. I'd heard of glow-in-the-dark rocks before. Who hasn't? But I'd always thought they were the kind of thing you found in museum gift shops next to the plastic dinosaurs and volcano kits. I had to Google what fluorescent actually meant in rock terms. Turns out, it's when certain minerals absorb ultraviolet light and re-emit it as visible light, like nature's own light show, built right into the stone. Most rocks only do it under special UV lamps, but some rare forms can fluoresce even under moonlight, though it's usually UV light that does the trick. Stony Johnny 47 wasn't done with his geological enthusiasm. Over the next hour, he explained that fluorescent quartz was used in high-tech applications, electronics, precision instruments, specialty glass. He also mentioned something that made my coffee mug nearly slip. Depending on the purity and specific fluorescence type, this stuff could be worth serious money. Life-changing money. But here's the thing that really got my attention. Stony Johnny 47 and his fellow rock enthusiasts kept asking the same question over and over. Where exactly did you find this? How much is there? Have you tested other samples from the same area? I realized I'd been thinking too small. I'd found one glowing rock, and thought I'd stumbled onto something cool. But what if that one rock wasn't a fluke? What if my brothers had unknowingly handed me 160 acres of buried treasure? The rest of that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat outside my trailer with a flashlight, walking grid patterns across my property like some kind of desert prospector from the 1800s. Every few feet, I'd find another rock, hold it up to the moonlight, and wait to see if it would glow. Most of them didn't. Most of them were just regular Texas rocks, content to sit there being rocks without any fancy light shows. But every so often, maybe one in 20 or 30, I'd find another one that lit up like a tiny blue-purple Christmas ornament. By sunrise, I had 17 glowing rocks lined up on my trailer steps like some kind of mystical rock concert. 17 pieces of potential fortune that had been sitting here in the middle of nowhere, waiting for someone stupid enough to move to the desert to notice them. I took pictures of each one, measured them, weighed them on my kitchen scale, made notes about where I'd found each sample. Suddenly, I felt less like a guy hiding out in the desert and more like a scientist conducting the most important research of his life. The geology forum had exploded overnight. Word had spread through the rock nerd community faster than gossip in a small town. I had messages from amateur geologists, mineral dealers, university professors, and at least 3 people who claimed to work for electronics companies that needed exactly this type of material. One message stood out from the rest. It was from a username called Professor Rockdoc, who identified himself as a geology professor at UT Austin. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to let him and a couple of graduate students drive out to examine my find in person. That's when it hit me that this wasn't just about finding a few pretty rocks anymore. This was about the possibility that my worthless inheritance might actually be worth something. Maybe worth a lot of something. I thought about my brothers, probably sitting in their air-conditioned offices right about then, making their important phone calls and feeling superior about their real estate and stock portfolios. They'd given me what they thought was nothing. What if nothing turned out to be everything? I spent the morning walking my property with new eyes. Instead of seeing a barren wasteland that even cactuses avoided, I started seeing potential. Geological potential. Financial potential. The kind of potential that could turn a repair shop mechanic into someone who mattered. The desert around me looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Same scrub brush. Same endless sky. Same silence that made you question whether the rest of the world still existed. But everything felt different, like I was standing on the edge of something huge, and all I had to do was decide whether to jump. As I walked back to my trailer, I remembered something my dad used to say when I was a kid working on old engines within the garage. Troy, the most valuable things are often hiding in plain sight. You just have to know how to look. At the time, I thought he was talking about finding the right wrench in a messy toolbox. Now I wondered if he'd been talking about something much bigger. Maybe he'd known something about this land that he'd never told anyone. Maybe that's why he'd left it to me instead of my brothers. Maybe that worthless piece of desert had been the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. And maybe he'd been waiting for someone patient enough and desperate enough to really look at what he'd given them. The rocks were calling my name now, too. And just like Mark Twain said, the only way to achieve anything is to start. I'd found my starting point, glowing blue-purple in the Texas moonlight. Time to see where it would take me. Time to see where it would take me. Well, it took me to the most surreal morning of my entire life. I woke up feeling like someone had slipped a treasure map under my pillow while I slept, not the groggy, coffee-dependent stumble I usually call waking up, but the kind of alertness that makes you feel like you could bench press a pickup truck. The geology forum had turned into something resembling a digital gold rush overnight. Stony Johnny 47 had apparently shared my photos with every rock nerd from here to Alaska, and my inbox looked like it had been hit by an avalanche of scientific enthusiasm. But the message that made my heart do gymnastics came from Professor Rockdoc at UT Austin. He wasn't just offering to visit anymore. He was practically begging. Apparently. Word spread through the university geology department faster than gossip at a church potluck, and now I had actual scientists want to drive 3 hours into the desert to examine my glowing rocks. 2 days later, I watched a white university van navigate the dirt road to my trailer like it was approaching an alien landing site. Out climbed Dr. Martinez and two graduate students who looked like they'd been drinking nothing but Red Bull and excitement for the past 48 hours. Sarah and Mike, both in their mid-20s, both practically vibrating with the kind of energy you only see in people who found their calling and are living it every single day. Sarah specialized in mineral crystallography, which apparently meant she could look at a rock and tell you its entire life story. Mike was the electronics applications guy, the one who knew how these glowing stones could be turned into something that actually mattered in the real world. They spent the first hour just walking around my property, picking up random rocks and examining them like they were reading ancient manuscripts. Every few minutes, one of them will hold up a sample and make sound that I can only describe as scientific purring. Then came the moment that changed everything. Dr. Martinez pulled out this portable UV light that looked like something from a sci-fi movie and started scanning the area where I'd found most of my glowing samples. At first, just a few scattered rocks lit up under the UV beam, but as he slowly swept the light across the ground, more and more began to respond, like buried stars blinking awake one by one, revealing veins of glowing stone just beneath the surface. We were looking at something much bigger than random scattered samples. This was a geological formation that extended way beyond what any of us had imagined. Sarah actually dropped her clipboard. Mike started laughing like he'd just won the lottery and found out his ex-girlfriend had moved to Mars on the same day. Dr. Martinez just stood there shaking his head and muttering something in Spanish that sounded either like a prayer or a very creative string of curse words. That's when they told me what I was really sitting on. Not just fluorescent quartz. Not just some pretty rocks that glowed in the dark. I was sitting on a geological formation that contained some of the purest piezoelectric quartz they'd ever seen outside of a laboratory. Piezoelectric. The word sounded like something you'd need a prescription for. But apparently, it meant my rocks could convert mechanical pressure into electrical energy. They were like tiny power generators built by Mother Nature herself. Perfect for everything from precision electronics to medical devices to military applications that Mike got really excited about but wasn't allowed to discuss in detail. The numbers they started throwing around made my head spin faster than a carnival ride. Market value per pound that had more zeros than my bank account had ever seen. Industrial applications that would make tech companies fight each other like kids over the last piece of birthday cake. But here's where the fairy tale hit the brick wall of reality. Because finding treasure is one thing. Actually being allowed to dig it up and sell it is something else entirely. Something that involves permits and regulations and bureaucrats who seem to exist solely to make your life as complicated as possible. I spent the next week drowning in paperwork that made tax forms look like children's coloring books. Environmental impact studies, geological surveys, mining permits that required other permits that required approval from committees that met once a month if you were lucky. The breakthrough moment came when I walked into the county clerk's office with my mining permit application. I'd done everything by the book, dotted every I, crossed every T, included every form and fee and official stamp they'd asked for. I was feeling pretty good about myself, like a guy who'd finally figured out how to beat the system at its own game. Then I met Mr. Garrison, county planning commissioner, and apparently the unofficial king of everything that happened in our little corner of Texas. The man looked like he'd been carved out of old leather and disappointment, wearing a suit that probably remembered when dinosaurs roamed the earth. He looked at my application like I'd handed him a dead fish, flipped through the pages with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. Then he leaned back in his chair and gave me the kind of smile that makes you check your wallet to make sure it's still there. Mr. Garrison informed me that while my paperwork was technically complete, there were certain unofficial considerations that needed to be taken into account. Local concerns, community impact, the thoughts and feelings of established families who had deep roots in the area. Translation, my brothers had gotten them first. Jake and Mark, those pillars of the community, had apparently expressed some concerns about their little brother's sudden interest in mining operations, concerns about environmental damage, concerns about noise and traffic, concerns that sounded suspiciously like jealousy wrapped up in official-sounding language. The message was crystal clear, without ever being directly stated. Nice little mining operation you got there. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Like permits getting lost in bureaucratic limbo for the next decade or two. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been punched in the gut by a ghost. Here I was, sitting on what might be millions of dollars worth of perfectly legal mineral wealth. And I was being shut down by the same family politics that had been holding me back my entire life. But you know what they say about being backed into a corner? Some people curl up and whimper. Others start looking for alternative exits. I'd spent 34 years curled up and whimpering. Time to try something different. That night, I sat in my trailer staring at my sample collection and thinking about every underdog story I'd ever heard. David and Goliath, Rocky Balboa, every small-town hero who'd ever faced down a system designed to keep them in their place. The common thread wasn't that they were stronger or smarter or luckier than everyone else. The common thread was that they refused to accept that the game was rigged. If the traditional path was blocked, I needed a non-traditional solution, something my brothers and their bureaucratic buddies wouldn't see coming, something that would let me work around their little boys club instead of trying to break through it. That's when I remembered the Mescalero Apache Reservation, about 20 miles south of my property. I'd driven past it dozens of times. But like most people, I never really thought about what went on behind those boundaries. Sovereign territory, their own laws, their own regulations, their own relationships with the federal government that bypassed the local good old boys network entirely. On reservation land, federal laws applied instead of state regulations. Local county commissioners had about as much authority there as they did on the moon. It was like a separate country inside our country, with its own rules and its own way of doing business. It was either brilliant or completely insane. Probably both. But sometimes the line between brilliant and insane is thinner than you think, and sometimes you have to cross it to find out which side you're really on. I remembered something Dad had mentioned years ago about helping repair generators at the reservation after a big storm back in the 90s. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention to his stories about working with the tribal maintenance crew. Now I wondered if that old connection might still mean something. The reservation's tribal offices were in a low, modern building that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood both tradition and practicality. The parking lot was half pickup trucks and half sedans, like a meeting point between two different worlds. I walked in there feeling like the most awkward person who'd ever attempted cross-cultural business negotiations. Here I was, a white guy from the repair shop, asking for a meeting with tribal leadership to discuss mining partnerships. It sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. But Chief Robert Yazzie turned out to be nothing like what I'd expected. Mid-50s, wearing jeans and a polo shirt instead of feathers and war paint that embarrassingly outdated movies had programmed into my brain. He had the kind of quiet intelligence that makes you realize how much noise most people make without actually saying anything important. I laid out my situation as honestly as I could. The mineral discovery, the potential value, the bureaucratic roadblock that my family had apparently constructed around my future. I showed him the sample rocks, which still glowed under his office's fluorescent lights like tiny alien artifacts. When I mentioned my dad's name and the generator work from years back, Chief Yazzie's expression shifted slightly. He remembered. My father had refused payment for that job, saying neighbors help neighbors when trouble hit. That kind of gesture apparently carries weight in a community where trust is earned over generations, not bought with handshakes and business cards. I laid out my proposal. The tribal council had been looking for economic development opportunities that could provide jobs for their young people while respecting their environmental responsibilities. A carefully managed mining operation, done with proper safeguards and fair profit sharing, might be exactly what they needed. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. The reservation's mineral rights were complicated, involving federal oversight and historical treaties that made my county permit problems look like a parking ticket. Any mining operation would need to be a true partnership, with the tribe as equal stakeholders rather than just landlords collecting rent. He was talking about something bigger than just letting me dig up rocks on their land. He was talking about creating a joint venture that would benefit both of us while giving the finger to the local political machine that thought it could control who succeeded and who failed in their little kingdom. It wouldn't be just a handshake deal. We'd form a formal joint venture, registered under tribal and federal oversight, clean, legal, and ours. I thought about every partnership I'd ever seen that started with good intentions and ended with lawyers and lawsuits and bitter feelings all around. I thought about the risks of trusting people I barely knew with a discovery that could change my entire life. I thought about the fact that I was about to bet everything on a handshake with someone from a culture I'd never taken the time to understand. Then I thought about my brothers, probably sitting in some restaurant right now, toasting their success at shutting down their disappointing little brother's impossible dreams. I thought about Mr. Garrison and his barely concealed contempt for anyone who didn't know their place in his carefully ordered world. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's succeeding so spectacularly that your enemies have to watch you win from the sidelines. Sometimes it's building something so impressive that the people who try to stop you end up wishing they'd helped instead. Chief Yazzie extended his hand across his desk, not for a handshake, but for a partnership that would change both our futures. As I reached out to meet his grip, I remembered something my dad used to say about building ships and dreaming of oceans. If you want to build a ship, you don't gather people to collect wood and assign them tasks. You teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. My sea was finally opening up in front of me, and I had partners who understood the navigation. My sea was finally opening up in front of me, and I had partners who understood the navigation. What happened next felt like stepping into someone else's success story, except that someone else was me, and the story was real. With the tribal council backing us up, we officially formed our joint venture, Desert Dawn Mining Cooperative. I know, it sounded a little poetic for a rock-digging operation, but I liked it. It symbolized new beginnings, fresh starts, the kind of dawn that comes after your darkest night and makes you believe the sun was worth waiting for. The paperwork alone could have killed a small forest, but Chief Yazzie's legal team knew exactly how to navigate the federal regulations that govern mineral extraction on sovereign territory. While my brothers and their county commissioner buddy were probably still trying to figure out how I disappeared from their little game board, we were already 3 moves ahead, playing by completely different rules. Setting up the operation was like building a small town from scratch. We brought in equipment that made my old repair shop tools look like toys from a cereal box. Excavators, sorting machines, precision testing equipment that could analyze a rock sample down to its molecular structure. But the real magic happened when we started hiring local workers. These were people who'd spent their entire lives looking at this land as empty space between here and somewhere else. Suddenly, they were learning to identify piezoelectric cords, to understand crystal formations, to handle materials worth more per pound than most people made in a month. I taught them everything I'd learned from Dr. Martinez and his team: how to spot the telltale signs of high-grade specimens, how to extract samples without damaging their internal structure, how to sort and grade materials that would end up in everything from smartphones to surgical instruments to military defense systems. It wasn't just a job for these folks. It was a transformation. Watching a 50-year-old ranch hand learn to operate electron microscopy equipment was like watching someone discover they had superpowers they never knew existed. These weren't just employees anymore. They were craftsmen, specialists, people who went home at night, knowing they were part of something bigger than themselves. The sense of community that developed around our operation was something I'd never experienced before. We weren't just extracting minerals from the ground. We were extracting potential from people who'd been told their whole lives that they lived in the middle of nowhere, doing nothing important. Our first major contract came from a company called Precision Electronic Solutions. Not exactly a household name, but they specialize in components for medical devices that required absolute reliability. Heart monitors, brain surgery equipment, the kind of technology where failure isn't just inconvenient. It's literally a matter of life and death. They needed piezoelectric crystals with specifications so precise that most suppliers couldn't even bid on the contract. But our stuff was apparently so pure, so perfect, that their quality control team thought our test samples were synthetic. For $100,000, that was our first payment, deposited into the Desert Dawn account on a Tuesday morning that felt like winning the lottery while simultaneously graduating from Harvard. When I saw those numbers on the bank statement, I had to sit down before my knees decided to take an unscheduled vacation from holding me up. This wasn't just money. This was vindication. This was proof that every person who'd ever written me off had been wrong. This was evidence that sometimes the best treasures really are hidden in the places nobody else wants to look. But more than that, it was validation for Chief Yazzie and his people. They'd taken a risk on a guy they barely knew, betting their reputation and their future on a partnership that could have blown up in all our faces. Now they were looking at profit-sharing checks that would fund education programs, healthcare initiatives, and infrastructure projects that had been on wish lists for decades. Word spread through the electronics industry faster than rumors in a high school cafeteria. Suddenly, we had companies calling us that I'd only seen in tech magazines. Samsung wanted samples. Apple suppliers were asking about long-term contracts. Military contractors were inquiring about materials for applications they couldn't discuss over unsecured phone lines. Each successful shipment built our reputation, like laying bricks in a foundation that would support bigger and bigger deals. We went from being an unknown startup to being the go-to source for premium piezoelectric materials in less than 6 months. Our quality was so consistent, our delivery so reliable, that we started getting orders for projects that wouldn't even begin for 2 years. The irony wasn't lost on me. My brothers had spent their entire careers building conventional businesses, using conventional methods in conventional markets. I'd stumbled into a niche so specialized that our main competition came from laboratories in Japan and Germany, not from other guys with backhoes in Texas. Of course, success has a way of attracting attention from people who think they deserve a piece of what you've built. It was inevitable that Jake would eventually show up at my operation. And when he did, it was like watching a nature documentary about predators who'd lost their prey. He rolled up in his expensive sedan, the kind of car that screams, "I make important decisions in air-conditioned offices," wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But something about his whole presentation felt desperate, like he was trying too hard to look like the successful brother coming to check on his wayward sibling. Jake's opening move was to act impressed, walking around our facility with the kind of fake enthusiasm people use when they're pretending to care about your vacation photos. He made all the right noises about our equipment, our setup, our obvious success. But I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was pricing everything he saw and figuring out how much he thought it might be worth. Then came the subtle hints about how families should stick together, how success was better when it was shared, how my operation could benefit from his business experience and his connections in the community. Classic Jake, positioning himself as a helpful big brother offering guidance to his lucky but naive little sibling. When the hints didn't work, he moved on to more direct proposals. Maybe he could help us expand into new markets. Maybe his construction company could handle some of our infrastructure needs. Maybe we should consider bringing in additional investors who could help us reach the next level of growth and profitability. Each suggestion was like watching someone try to pick a lock while pretending they were just cleaning the doorknob. He wanted in. He wanted a piece of what we'd built. And he absolutely couldn't stand the fact that his failure of a little brother had created something valuable without asking for his permission or his help. When I didn't bite on any of his helpful suggestions, Jake's mask started to slip. The fake friendliness gave way to thinly veiled threats about regulatory compliance and environmental oversight, about how unfortunate it would be if someone filed complaints about our operations with the appropriate authorities, about how complex tribal sovereignty could be when it came to interstate commerce regulations. That's when I knew he'd finally shown his true colors. This wasn't about family unity or business opportunities. This was about control, about making sure that if he couldn't have what I'd built, then maybe I shouldn't have it either. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. Jake was scared. Not of me, exactly, but of what my success meant about his own assumptions regarding how the world worked. If the family failure could build something this impressive, what did that say about the family success stories? My response was quieter than he'd probably expected. I told him about our partners in the tribal council, about our federal oversight and our legal protections, about the fact that we were building something bigger than anything he could imagine or threaten. His help wasn't needed. His approval wasn't required. And his threats weren't particularly impressive when stacked up against the reality of what we'd already accomplished. The look on Jake's face was worth every year of condescension I'd endured from him. This wasn't the Troy he remembered. This wasn't the guy who fixed air conditioners and accepted hand-me-downs without complaint. This was someone who'd learned that success isn't about having the right connections or playing by the established rules. Sometimes it's about writing your own rules and playing a completely different game. As I watched him drive away, probably already planning his next attempt at interference, I realized something important. This wasn't just about making money anymore. This was about personal growth, about becoming the person I'd always had the potential to be, but never had the opportunity or the courage to discover. Albert Schweitzer once said that success is not the key to happiness, but happiness is the key to success. If you love what you're doing, you will be successful. And standing there watching my operation run like a perfectly tuned machine, with people who respected what we were building and partners who shared our vision for the future, I realized I found both success and happiness in the same unlikely place. The next few months flew by like a time-lapse video of everything I'd ever dreamed about but never dared to hope for. Our operation expanded. Our contracts grew larger and more prestigious. Our reputation in the industry became so solid that we started getting invitations to trade shows and conferences where our materials were featured in technical presentations and case studies. Then came the offer that changed everything. A major electronics conglomerate, the kind of company whose products are in every home in America, wanted to license our entire operation, not just by our materials, but by the rights to our extraction methods, our quality control processes, our geological surveys, everything we'd built from the ground up. $11.2 million. That was the number they put on the table. More money than I'd ever imagined having, let alone earning from a patch of desert that my own family had considered worthless. More money than my brothers had made from all their conventional business ventures combined. The signing ceremony was surreal. Lawyers and executives flying in from corporate headquarters. Contracts thick enough to stop bullets. Handshakes and photographs and congratulations from people who'd probably never heard my name 6 months earlier. Chief Yazzie was there, along with several members of the tribal council, signing documents that would fund their community development projects for the next decade. But the real validation came when the national media picked up the story. Suddenly, I was the subject of feature articles about American entrepreneurship and the potential for success in unexpected places. Network news crews were setting up cameras at our site, interviewing workers, filming the operations that had transformed a wasteland into a thriving enterprise. The reporters loved the narrative, the underdog brother who'd been given the worthless inheritance and turned it into a multi-million-dollar business. The partnership between a small-town repair shop mechanic and a Native American tribe. The discovery that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and determination to find it. What they didn't fully understand was that this wasn't just a story about finding valuable minerals. This was a story about finding yourself, about discovering that the person everyone thought they knew was just a rough draft of who you could become when the right circumstances finally revealed your true potential. The final scene for the television feature was perfect. I stood at the edge of our main excavation site, where the desert I'd inherited had been transformed into a carefully managed operation that extracted millions of dollars worth of materials while respecting the land and the people who'd called it home for generations. Behind me, workers operated equipment that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. Trucks loaded with precisely sorted materials headed toward processing facilities that would turn our discoveries into components for technologies that would improve lives around the world. And above it all, mounted on a steel frame that could be seen from the highway, was a sign I commissioned to mark our success. Large, permanent, and engraved with words that told the real story of what had happened here. 3 brothers mistake quarry. Not just my triumph, but a monument to their short-sightedness. A reminder that sometimes the biggest mistakes aren't the chances you take, but the opportunities you dismiss without really looking at what they might become. Jake and Mark? One of them is still convinced the whole thing is some kind of elaborate fraud that will eventually be exposed. The other hired lawyers to challenge our mineral rights, our partnerships, our environmental compliance, anything that might give them a foothold in our success. But nobody listens to them anymore. Their credibility died about the same time our first major contract proved that the family failure had become the family success story. My victory wasn't just financial. It was carved in stone, visible from space, and permanent enough to outlast every doubt that had ever been cast about my potential. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even with the people who wronged you. Sometimes it's succeeding so completely that they have to live with the knowledge of what they missed. Sometimes I park the truck at the edge of the quarry and just sit there, looking up at that sign. The desert wind whistles, machines hum in the distance, and I remember the day they told me this land was worthless. Now it has a name, a future, a legacy. I used to think value came from what others gave you, respect, approval, inheritance. But the truth? Value comes from what you uncover in yourself when no one else believes it's there. Turns out, you don't need permission to succeed. Just persistence, a bit of luck, and the guts to dig where everyone else walks away. Sometimes all it takes is the patience to keep digging, even when everyone else has given up on the ground beneath your feet.